Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, July 28th. Whoa, it's almost August. And we will hear uncovering resiliency and equity in disaster recovery. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to answer those technical questions. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I will ask, just for efficiency's sake, if your question is for a particular panelist, please type that person's name in with your question. Up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2023. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we welcome the Oregon chapter of APA. And perhaps, we didn't even have a discussion about if it's Oregon or Oregon or, there's controversy. We'll have to get into that for a moment. So thank you for joining us. You might never join us again, but we thank you at least for today. Up on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions that are available for you to register for. Just head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, and you can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions. We're kind of wrapping up our summer season here, and we'll be starting our fall season in September with a great lineup of sessions coming your way. Today's session has been approved for all the things. You can get 1.5 regular CM credits, or you can get 1 of the required sustainability and resilience credits, or you can log 1 of the required equity credits. And you can do that by heading over to planning.org. From there, log into your My APA account, and then you can search for today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I'll post when new sessions are available for you to register for. And I post a weekly reminder of what session is on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when we have new sessions available. If you head over there now, you'll see that we have well over 400 session recordings available for you to view for free. So again, type those questions into the Q&A box. We'll get to them at the end during the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kate. And then just so you know, after Kate is finished with her intro, we just have a couple polling questions. So be ready and alert, and we will get to those shortly. So Kate, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and stop sharing my screen. And Susan, you can jump in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. And welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Kate Rogers. I am a senior planner with MIG in the Portland office here in Oregon. That's Oregon, not Oregon. And I am a volunteer for the Professional Development Committee for the Oregon chapter of APA. And I kind of helped pull together this webinar today. And I'm just really excited to share the work that some of our volunteers for the CAP program with the Oregon chapter have been working on. And I will let those folks introduce themselves. I just wanted to give a couple of quick updates about some upcoming events for Oregon APA. So in September on the 14th, there's the Central Oregon Planners Walking Tour of Redmond, Oregon. So if you're local to that area, that's coming up. And then later in October on the 25th through the 27th, we have our annual planning conference for the OAPA chapter. And the theme for that conference is embracing the next 50 years. And it's really kind of reflecting on the 50 years of the Oregon State Planning Program and thinking about, how we'll sort of refine that and keep moving that forward in the next 50 years. And so that's in Eugene, and registration will open pretty soon in August. And you can learn more about all of our upcoming events on the Oregon page of APA. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and do our polls and kind of get a sense of who was out there in the audience today.
All right, I'll go ahead and launch our first poll. We just want to know where you're coming from, what part of the country. So go ahead, you should see a pop-up to my panelists. You're not allowed to vote. I'm sorry. So we'll just give it a few moments here. And then I'll share the results. If you're on a mobile device, sometimes the pop-up doesn't work properly. So if you are on like a cell phone and you don't see the pop-up, it's probably not you. It's just the fact that you're on a cell phone. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share the results. So we got everybody coming from everywhere. We have a really nice mix of folks from pretty much coast to coast. Thank you. Okay, I just want to go back and launch another poll. We just want to know what kind of entity you work for. And depending on your screen type, there is a bar that you can drag down for additional choices. So in the event that your screen doesn't enlarge it the whole way. Okay. Didn't lose that. Okay. Show the results. I guess I'm surprised, not surprised, that we have almost 30% of our attendees are from the private sector. And then coming in at the top is those that are public sector for the city, local, and then county, regional, state, and then a smattering of everything else. Great. It's nice to see all this nice variety. Okay, last polling question. Your experience with disaster-related planning, mitigation, recovery, resiliency. So go ahead and answer those. It's what I do every day. I've worked on some related planning, coordinated, worked near it. I work in some other realm, or I don't have any experience yet. Give it another 5 seconds. Well, this group of panelists has their work cut out for them, because we have about 40% of those on the line don't have experience yet. So it's good that you're here, because you're going to hear a lot about things. And then coming in second is I've worked on some disaster related planning, but it's not my primary job. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Thanks everyone who participated in these polling questions, just to kind of give our panelists kind of sneak peek on who's on the other line. So I am going to mute myself and we can get the show on the road.
Great, thank you. I'm going to kick us off today. Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Myhoff. We'll do introductions in just a moment. Susan, if you could get to the next slide here. So I'm going to kick us off just giving you a little recap of what we're here to learn and present about today. We are going to share some experiences we've had with assisting in disaster recovery as a chapter. We're going to provide a window into understanding some of the challenges, some of the systemic barriers and opportunities for more resilient and equitable rebuilding in areas that have undergone massive changes through disaster. We'll highlight some new planning methods that Oregon APA CAP, I'll explain what that is in a minute, our teams have undertaken in partnership with city and county leaders, disaster recovery coordinators, public health and planning professionals. And then we'll also share some big picture sort of lessons learned, challenges, discoveries, and what's in store in Oregon going forward. So we've organized the session today. We'll give you a little bit of context after introductions. We'll give you a little bit of context about what we're talking about when we're talking about the 2020 wildfires in Oregon. Then we're going to share a little bit about Oregon APA's experiences helping with wildfire recovery, and we'll do that through a series of 4 case studies that are related to some projects we worked on. And then we'll have sort of the big picture takeaways, as I mentioned, and plenty of time for question and answer and discussion. And to be here. So next slide, please, Susan. Thank you. So just a little recap of Oregon APA. We're 800 members across Oregon. For those of you, it looked like there were quite a few on the East Coast. Just a reminder that Oregon's a really large, geographically large state. It's about 400 miles wide by 300 miles tall, if you will. So it can take many hours to drive from place to place. This is really important as we start thinking about some of the work we've done with wildfire recovery. But our members are also across the state, and we do a lot of collaboration that way. So in 2016, our chapter started its own pro bono planning program, modeled after National's prior program, which was the community planning assistance teams. It's a smaller effort than National used to do, and really based on community-based workshops and sort of equitable engagement of communities and planning activities. And we donate our time. There's other chapters such as New Jersey, state of Washington, Chicago, a few others, sorry, I'm not mentioning them all, who also have local pro bono planning programs. If you'd like to hear more, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to connect you to your local chapter or talk to you about how to set up one, just a plug. But more importantly, our pro bono program, as I mentioned, started as community-based workshops. Then the pandemic hit, then wildfires hit. And so we really pivoted how we were offering services and what we were offering. And we were looking for ways to leverage our volunteers and our resources for wildfire recovery. We have about 60 members who have volunteered, not just with the wildfire recovery, but some of our other CAP projects. That's the Community Assistance Planning Program. And for wildfire recovery work specifically, our chapter has donated, we think, I mean, we don't keep exact books, but we've done a pretty good estimation. We think it's somewhere north of 2,000 hours that we've donated to communities across Oregon in the last couple of years. So who is the we? Why don't we go ahead and do some introductions of our panel, and then we'll get going. So again, I mentioned my name is Deb Myhoff. I am principal and owner of Communitas, a private consulting firm based in Portland. And I, as I mentioned, started the CAP program. I direct the program still. I'm the education and outreach chair for the Oregon chapter of APA. And so I sit on the board as well with that. And then in my day job, I don't do recovery planning very often, but more now. But I do sort of strategic redevelopment planning, implementation planning, helping people figure out how to marshal resources and funding to get projects and plans implemented. So I'm going to hand it over to our next panelist, Erin Riom, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Riom. I'm a senior project manager and planner at Sarah Architects, and I also sit on the Education and Outreach Committee with Deb, and I was kind of the instigator, I guess, for getting the CAP program involved in all of this wildfire recovery work. My day job, like Deb's, is not focused on recovery projects, or at least it wasn't prior to all of this volunteer experience. I focus more on downtown and neighborhood planning. But since doing all of this volunteer work, this has really become kind of a passion point for me, and I've started to take on a little bit more of the recovery work as well. And Mary, I think you're up next.
Okay, now we've unmuted. My name is Mary Hepperling Creighton, and I do work in disaster recovery, although I didn't when I did CAP. So it was kind of this fun little kind of process that I went through. But I was on the CAP project for Lane County, which you'll hear more about in one of our case studies. I'm also on the Education and Outreach Committee for the Oregon chapter of APA. And I have previously worked in small/medium-sized cities around the Portland metro region. And I made a shift kind of after this CAP program that sort of brought a lot of interest to me. And so now I work for the state of Oregon in our Oregon Housing and Community Services Department in their disaster resiliency and recovery program. So I deal very closely with disaster recovery now.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. My name is Susan Millhauser, and I am working for the state of Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development as a natural hazards mitigation planner with a focus on wildfire. When the CAP projects kicked off and pretty much through their completion, I was working with the Oregon APA chapter as a program and policy coordinator and working with all of the wonderful CAP volunteers and our Education Outreach Committee and other OAPA committees. I also hadn't had a lot of experience with wildfire recovery work, but really gained that through the CAP project and had done some natural hazard mitigation planning in the past and have been working for DLCD for about a year and a half and was hired to implement the agency's response to Senate Bill 762, which was Oregon's wildfire bill that was passed in 2021, which I'll talk about towards the end. And glad to be here. I'll pass it over.
Hello, I am Emma Quinn Smith. I am a planner at MIG here in Portland. I also do not work in disaster recovery or resiliency on a day-to-day basis, but I do work in a lot of small communities throughout Oregon, helping with long range and current planning efforts. Get started.
All right, so I'll get us started in kind of a very high level overview of kind of what happened in 2020 and what led to us needing to do these CAP projects. So next slide, Susan. So this is a map of the burn scars from the 2020 wildfires. As you can see here, it was kind of, we like to kind of call this the I-5 corridor. It's our freeway kind of goes down north-south. It sort of followed that, interestingly enough, but it was statewide. And this happened in September of 2020. We had a historically extreme wind event that was combined with dry weather conditions during that time of the year. So the winds downed power lines, they toppled trees, and it sparked new fires and also made existing fires spread faster. In 2020, most of Oregon was classified as being under severe drought. So we already had low moisture content in our vegetation, and landscape was just more easy to burn. And so it kind of was a culmination of a lot of factors that really provided a condition that made wildfire spread very easily at that time. The event included 21 fires that burned more than 1.2 million acres. 5 of the fires grew into mega fires, which is defined as fires that burn areas larger than 100,000 acres. And Oregon has never experienced more than one fire over 100,000 acres during a fire season in the state's recorded history. So this was a huge event for us. And all of the major fires were contained in early December of 2020. And on top of that, this all happened during the COVID pandemic as well. Next slide, please. So the disaster was presidentially declared on September 15th of 2020. And it didn't fully contained until November. And then, like I said, it was kind of all cleared out in December. 20 of Oregon's 36 counties were included in the disaster declaration. And these counties were eligible for Federal Emergency Management Agency programs, so FEMA, based on the impacts of the disaster here. And then in particular, the counties that are in red here are ones that were hit the hardest, and the areas where we focused a lot of our CAP projects on. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of Talent, Oregon, which we'll get to in a little bit. But overall, more than 40,000 residents had to evacuate, and more than 500,000 were placed on evacuation notice. More than 4,300 homes were damaged or destroyed, and of those 4,300 homes burned, nearly half were manufactured homes, which is a very big deal, especially for communities who are lower income. Manufactured home parks are one of the more affordable housing options for people who are lower income, and so this was a big loss for those communities. 50% of all the housing that was lost happened in Jackson County, which is in Southern Oregon, and that's where Talent is located. And so this is a photo of a mobile home park in Talent, Oregon as well. And yeah, so I think we will go into our case studies now, and or a little bit more about the Oregon land use system, and I'll hand it off to Susan, and then we'll go into our case studies.
All right, successfully turned on the camera and unmuted. Yeah, as Mary mentioned, before we get into the case studies, I'm going to provide just a little planning context, including a quick recap of Oregon's land use planning program for those of you who may be joining us from outside of Oregon, as well as an overview of the state's role in recovery related to community planning and capacity building. So as was mentioned by Kate at the introduction with the upcoming OAPA conference, Oregon is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the signing of Senate Bill 100, which created the Oregon Department of Land Conservation Development, and really the origination of our statewide land use planning program. And under this program, DLCD works in partnership with local governments to really create and foster, the quality and character of Oregon's natural and built environment. The foundation of Oregon's land use planning program is a set of 19 statewide planning goals, and the goals really express the state's policies on land use and related topics like community involvement, housing, natural hazards, transportation, and natural resources. And Oregon's, these statewide goals are really achieved through local comprehensive planning at the city and county level, as well as regional planning. And I'll just note that, managed urban growth, protected farm and forest lands, really the working lands of Oregon, and preserved coastal and natural resources and livable communities are hallmarks of the program. I'll also note that Thousand Friends of Oregon, which is a land use advocacy organization that's worked in Oregon a long time, they did a great report, I want to say it was in 2019, looking at how Oregon's form of urban growth management and compact urban development that really protects farm and forest lands has done double duty in keeping areas adjacent to wildland urban interfaces from more intense development. So the nature of our land use planning program really over time has helped reduce impacts to people and property from wildfire. All right, some quick information about State Recovery Function 1, which is community planning and capacity building. In Oregon's emergency response system, DLCD is the coordinating agency for the State Recovery Function 1. And you can see on the slide the goal that the agency came up with in the wake of the 2020 wildfires, really trying to embrace, health and equity and resilience, and kind of a vision that, as an agency, we could support communities to really, strategically rebuild to achieve their local visions. I'll note that there are 7 state recovery functions assigned to different state agencies, and these are all aligned with federal coordinating agencies. FEMA is the federal coordinating agency for community planning and capacity building. And early on in our work with the CAP projects, connecting with FEMA staff who had ties to Oregon was really critical in helping us to figure out how to support communities with these projects. And I'll also note Oregon Housing and Community Services, their state recovery function is 5, which is disaster housing. Others look at economic recovery, health services, social services, and infrastructure systems, and natural and cultural resources. And also real quick, just to give you an overview of the types of communities that were impacted by the 2020 wildfires. And this is kind of from a state land use planning perspective. Really a range of community types were impacted, from urban to rural. So cities and unincorporated areas within an urban growth boundary were impacted in Southern Oregon, in Jackson County with the Alameda and South Oban chain fires. Cities and in more rural areas were impacted in the Santiam Canyon, so smaller incorporated cities surrounded by rural areas up in the foothills of the Cascades. And then the unincorporated rural communities, which is a different land use designation, and rural areas out at the coast and in Lane and Douglas counties were impacted. So really quite a range from a land use planning perspective. I'll also note shortly thereafter, a couple of months, DLCD regional representatives started to work with communities to help coordinate needed services, coordinating with other state agencies, FEMA, other local governments, nonprofits, and service providers. And some money was provided by the legislature for DLCD to pass through local governments to help them with permitting capacity, hire consultants to help just start to get building permits out the door in the wake of the fires. And we also funded a floodplain mapping study up in the Santiam Canyon that through the Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. And also our commission, which does state rulemaking, conducted quick rulemaking to allow temporary homes for displaced residents, which aided tremendously in local and regional recovery and rebuilding efforts in the aftermath. All right, so I'm gonna quickly give you another overview of the CAP projects. We mentioned there were 4 impacted areas, which are circled kind of in the hot pink on the screen. We had 4 different scopes of work and outcomes for each project. And through our case studies, we're going to give you a high-level recap of the work we did and some key takeaways related to equity and resilience. And so here we have Echo Mountain out on the coast in Lincoln County, an area that wasn't particularly considered a high risk for wildfire. And then up in the Santiam Canyon, so that's east of Salem, the state capital, there were 2 fires that came together in the Beachy Creek fire, Holiday Farm fire, also in a rural area east of Eugene, up the river canyon, the McKenzie River. And then down in Southern Oregon, the Alameda fire, which really is a much more urbanized area that also wasn't considered at high risk for wildfire. It wasn't really close to the wildland-urban interface. And I'm going to hand it off to Erin.
Thank you, Susan. So we're going to talk first about the CAP efforts that we did for the Holiday Farm fire and their recovery process. So Susan, if you can go to the next slide, just to give you a bit of orientation to the location. The Holiday Farm fire occurred just east of Eugene. As Susan mentioned, Eugene is home to the University of Oregon, if there happen to be any Ducks fans out there in the audience. And next. We're going to zoom in really quickly and take a look at the burn scar for the area that's going to be highlighted in red in the map that should pop up on your screen in a minute. In total, the fire burned about 175,000 acres. Much of this was farmland and timberland, but it also impacted quite a few small communities along the McKenzie River corridor as well. And many of these towns date back to the early 1800s. They were mining and timber towns. And in more recent decades, as those industries have declined a little bit, they've become destinations for recreation. Specifically, this area is known as a great fly fishing destination. In total, 174 formal dwellings were lost, but there were hundreds of people in RVs and non-permitted units that were also displaced. And there's no official count for those because they were never considered official dwellings within our land use system. And it's those losses that really formed the focus of our work for the CAPP project that we did for Lane County. Next slide. So our work on the Holiday Farm fire extended from March to July of 2022. And we worked directly with Lane County's disaster recovery manager, as well as FEMA representatives to identify how best we could help with our team of volunteers. And very quickly identified the need to look more closely at the people who are being missed in the recovery efforts that were happening. Basically document who those groups are, how and why they're being missed, and also offer some recommendations for next steps. Next slide. So we approached this project through two different avenues. First, we looked at the Vision Link data that had been collected by the Oregon Department of Human Services and the Oregon Health Authority. And we also interviewed caseworkers. And we quickly found that the data was extremely limited in terms of who and what it captured. And that was actually pretty telling. In order to have an entry in the system, a person would have needed to have registered with a FEMA ID. And what we heard as we started interviewing caseworkers is that a lot of the people who are being missed in the recovery efforts were the folks who were least likely to be registering with FEMA and with other government agencies. Many of them were living very intentionally off the grid for a variety of different reasons. And because of those limitations, our work ended up focusing much more on what we heard in the caseworker interviews. Next slide. And from those interviews, we learned a lot. We heard extensively about the many people who were living off the grid and had been displaced, as well as seniors, houseless individuals, and lower and middle income landowners, people who wouldn't be eligible for insurance payouts, and people who may have a very difficult time navigating the relief systems that were available. We heard that many people had been turned off by the system early on because volunteers who had been deployed to the area, not the local volunteers, but people who came in from out of state, hadn't necessarily been well trained in how to work with trauma victims and hadn't shown the level of empathy and patience that was really needed. We also heard about how unprepared the community was to navigate the disaster or the recovery process that needed to begin immediately in its aftermath. Next. So the systems that are available to provide relief can be really difficult to navigate, and a lot of people don't know where to go for help. Many others were distrustful of government systems and chose not to pursue relief. And all of this was, of course, exacerbated by the fact that it happened right in the peak of the pandemic. We also heard that the permitting system at the county was completely bogged down, and many residents were choosing not to return or to rebuild, either because they had an unpermitted structure that they wouldn't be allowed to rebuild under current codes, or because the permitting process was just too arduous for it to be worthwhile. And all of this had big ripple effects across the local economy as well as the local schools. Next. So hearing all of this, we put together a set of recommendations. First of which was to update local codes and land use planning to be a little bit more sensitive to some of the off-the-grid lifestyles that were prevalent in the area pre-fire. We also recommended exploring a variety of different housing typologies as reconstruction occurs. Simply looking at single-family homes may not be the best fit for all of the folks who were displaced. We also recommended creating a visioning and resilience plan for the area, and ideally one that engages a wide swath of the community and is representative of a diversity of voices and different perspectives. And finally, we also recommended updating the systems and operations plans to perform more efficiently should something like this occur again. So next slide, please, Susan. As we look at kind of what our team took away from this effort, we learned quite a few things. First and foremost, that insurance payments really aren't enough. There were many people who were impacted who were uninsured, especially those who were living in manufactured homes. And even for those who had insurance, oftentimes it wasn't enough to cover the cost of rebuilding, particularly given the construction price escalation that we've seen over the last few years. Also, case managers felt really unprepared with no guides or plans to be able to assist community and local organizations to respond quickly. And also that there was a lack of trauma-informed care for those case managers specifically. They really needed support as well, and that just wasn't available to them. And finally, that there was no community vision in place before the emergency. And despite having lots of grant funding available, to help with the recovery efforts, without a vision plan in place, communities weren't able to take advantage of that immediate grant funding. So that was a key thing that stood out to us as well. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma Quinn to talk about our next case study.
Thanks, Erin. So I'll be sharing some more about our work with the Alameda Fire Recovery in the City of Talent. Next slide, please. The City of Talent is in Southern Oregon, not too far from the border with California. This is the most urbanized area of case studies and CAP projects that we worked on. It's also one of the most destructive fires in Oregon history and of the fire recovery efforts that we worked on. About 3,200 acres were burned and over 2,600 structures were destroyed, and it impacted 37% of the City of Talent's land area. The image on the screen right now is the main highway that runs through the City of Talent. The fire just burned straight through the city, and kind of centered on the screen are what were previously mobile home parks, some of the most deeply affordable housing available in the city. And as a result of that, a high proportion of people with lower incomes and Spanish-speaking families lost their homes. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this project was to really lay the foundation for longer-term decisions and planning efforts in the City of Talent. We were tasked with creating a resource that would help catalyze and support grant and funding proposals for the city moving forward. We also wanted to create a framework for community conversations about the long-term rebuilding opportunities and priorities. As Erin mentioned, in Lane County is similar in Talent. There wasn't a big vision for the future of the city prior to the fire, and there certainly was not a vision after the chaos of the fire. We also sought to facilitate coordination and partnerships with other jurisdictions and recovery organizations across all levels of government and sectors. And we also wanted to help the city identify potential project opportunities moving forward, or other areas that the city could study or consider, some less common project types they could look into perhaps. And really, we just wanted to set the stage for and inform a community-based planning and recovery process. Next slide, please. Working in Talent, we had a few challenges that were not unique to most recovery planning efforts, but we did have a few challenges that were unique to this community. As with any recovery effort, we wanted to balance the first priority, which is dealing with and addressing the immediate short-term needs of residents. Talent is a small town and it has a limited set of staff and high turnover rates of staff. And as with any recovery project, the community members who we're working with were also dealing with trauma of the unexpected and destructive event. So in order to help mitigate some of those challenges and address the priorities that the community had, we partnered with Sarah Architects and a summer class at the University of Oregon to engage in some info gathering and listening sessions with community members and also city staff. This project was really supporting city staff by working in the background. There were several parallel planning efforts happening in the community or getting ready to happen in the community as our project was going on, and we didn't want to burn residents out. So we were really working to create a resource that could be used by consultants or future city staff when other planning processes were ready to take off. So to accomplish all of these goals, we created a dashboard of information that could be used as sort of onboarding and provide consistent information across any consultant or staff team that might take on a project. And the dashboard really provided strategies that can be used in recovery or resilience planning, not only in talent, but some best practices for efforts really anywhere. Next slide, please. So this is what our dashboard looked like. It took the form of a very interactive and highly linked PDF, which is available to explore on the Oregon CAPP webpage. These are some of the topics that we touched on, and it linked to resources that we found in our information gathering and also some best practice documents around the web. Next slide, please. We also created an affordable housing lookbook specifically to address the city's newfound need for deeply affordable housing after a large portion of the mobile home stock was lost to the fire. The city really had a desire to find new and innovative options for housing choices. So our team created this resource to help the city kind of decide and explore some new innovative housing options. Next slide, please. One of the key pieces of this framework and this dashboard was to create an equitable engagement framework for the city to use. One of the major challenges in talent and basically all other communities affected by disasters is avoiding engagement fatigue, as I mentioned earlier. And talent asked us to help outline a process for that equitable community engagement for follow-on planning work in the community. And the foundation of any equitable engagement is really understanding the community where you're working in and learning the history of the place that you're working in through listening to the stories of those who lived there even before the people with whom you're working currently. Next slide, please. So to create our equitable engagement framework, we wanted to center the engagement process on what community members needed, not necessarily what governments or other city leaders needed. We also really emphasized building trusting relationships between consultants, city leadership, politicians, any consultants that might be working in the community, and also giving all community members access to decision-making and encouraging a sense of ownership and future stewardship over any plan outcomes are all kind of the key tenets of equitable engagement that we identified. I won't go through all these best practices, but one of the common threads for engagement across all of our CAPP projects that was particularly true in talent was understanding that community members have experienced a major trauma, and in doing engagement and talking with community members, listening to community members' stories, there's going to be a part of the process that may involve a certain level of grieving for residents. And as someone listening to all of this, you have to be prepared to take on that level of kind of emotional storytelling that these people come to you with. So it can be hard to do recovery work, and we'll talk more about this later, but that's just something to be aware of, being prepared to take that on. We also wanted to ensure that meetings and all written materials were consistently in all language. So hosting meetings that were bilingual, not just transcribing meetings and then translating it to Spanish. That doesn't create the same experience for all community members in the engagement process. Also using a variety of engagement methods and paying participants for their time. Not everyone is able to come to an evening meeting. Not everyone has access to the internet or a device to take an online survey. So reaching out to people in a variety of ways is one of the best ways to provide an equitable engagement opportunity. Providing childcare and ways for children to be involved. Children are the future of communities, as we know. So hearing their big ideas and what they would like to see for the community that they're growing up in and building is a great way to foster the next generation of a community. And also being sensitive to other cultural events, religious observances, or other city events happening when scheduling meetings is important. You can also piggyback off of existing city events that people might already be coming out to. And finally, holding events in accessible and safe places, spaces that community members are already familiar with and feel comfortable in, and also areas that provide reliable transit access and ADA accessibility, and are close to community members who you want to hear from, are all important parts of an equitable engagement process. Next, please. So we had several recovery planning lessons from talent. Planning in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, in the 6 to 12 months, looks very different than planning a year on from a disaster. People are working to get their basic needs met, and they're not really concerned with the next long-term vision for their community. But what planners can do in the immediate term is really help by facilitating community and connection, providing places for people to gather and support each other, share information, and tell their stories, and have their stories heard is a really good opportunity for planners in the short term after disaster. At this point in the process, you shouldn't be looking at hosting a workshop where people are putting stickers on boards or looking at precedent images. Early on in the recovery process, it's really just about listening. You have to enter the process with compassion and sensitivity and recognize that any process, help and assistance from outside organizations is going to be slow. It's slow for those recovery workers to access the funds, and it's also very slow for those resources to materialize for many survivors through either like state or federal organizations. Planners also can be critical in helping the community get organized and helping the city planning departments get organized or whatever level jurisdiction you're working in. So using this short-term recovery timeline to help understand planning systems that could be changed or develop materials that can be used for grant applications or other recovery funding. And finally, knowing your planning networks throughout your state and other levels of community that you might be working in is important. The city and county staff and leaders may have also been displaced by the fires in the communities that you're working in. So it's important to know who else in your network you can reach out to for help with recovery. And now Susan is going to discuss our Lincoln County project on the Oregon coast.
Great, thank you so much, Emma Quinn. Yeah, I will provide a quick overview of the Lincoln County Echo Mountain Fire project. This project, first I'll share a little bit about the fire impacts. Almost 300 homes were destroyed. Approximately 1,200 people were displaced. Many more were evacuated in an area with not a lot of road connectivity along the coast. So and businesses and infrastructure were also destroyed. And there was really a significant loss of housing affordability on the coast, really workforce housing, rural housing, where folks maybe were working in coastal resort towns, but living up, more in the mountains. Really highly impacted in the area around Otis, where the fire was centered. And also forests, natural areas, and other recreational attractions were impacted as well, which is really, lifeblood of a rural community out on the coast. The outdoor recreation is really a key part of what happens in those communities. And you can see the image on the screen. This is a picture from the Salmon River Grange near Otis. And that was an existing Grange and community organization that really quickly became a hub for disaster survivors, and really continues to be a community resource. It's a place that really has morphed to do more work beyond supporting wildfire recovery and community members who were impacted. And this is just one great example of how building relationships and capacity in advance of a disaster is key to community recovery. The Lincoln County project was a little different than the other projects. It was really focused on CAPP volunteers working with city and county leadership, a county commissioner in particular, as well as members of the long-term recovery group, to set up a series of conversations with stakeholders and partners, and to help facilitate conversations. And so really the goal was to ensure alignment of recovery projects that were underway or soon to start, identify opportunities for partnerships and joint funding requests, and really to begin framing some conversations about long-term rebuilding options and set the stage to address other community identified issues. So similar to some of these other projects, we wanted to provide support that was helpful to the county, and this was an area where they identified, that we could help with some facilitating some conversations. And really, as you're hearing throughout all of these case studies, as disasters have become more common in Oregon and in other places, communities and planners have increasingly found themselves needing to address both disaster recovery and resilience. And our work, we were working with the long-term recovery group in Lincoln County, as well as Lincoln County's internal cross-departmental recovery team. And so the facilitated group discussions were framed around these questions about what long-term success could look like. And these were really some kind of open-ended questions to get conversations going. What would the area look like when it's fully recovered? How would the participants know that they were quote unquote recovered? What more might need to be done beyond identified priority activities? Kind of those short-term needs, for housing and infrastructure and, debris removal and all of the things that happen immediately after a disaster. We had a conversation about what could be done differently to ensure that all the survivors have a successful recovery. And similar to our other projects, we had conversations around opportunities to address collective trauma and how more resilient communities could really be built through recovery activities. Some of the key takeaways that you'll hear some common themes here, but that building relationships and trust is key. What we heard from folks in Lincoln County was that before the fire, many of the impacted community members who were living rurally, also some informal living situations, shared land, mobile homes and other dwellings that weren't necessarily permitted, really hadn't engaged much with the government. And so that was one issue to really overcome, and trying to get information out to people who weren't necessarily trustful of the government. And really through these efforts, some leadership has emerged with the focus beyond recovery. The school district and local faith communities, as well as health system staff, were really key in connecting with impacted community members. Another common theme is that Spanish language access was an issue. While there was some information provided in Spanish and the disaster case managers, there was translation services available. What we heard through our conversations was that this wasn't sufficient, and there was one community member in particular who was on the long-term recovery group who shared that she really became a very important resource for the Spanish-speaking community. It was pretty tight-knit community and really filling some gaps for folks who needed help in understanding who to contact around permitting or getting temporary power turned on, things that weren't necessarily under the county's purview. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Another takeaway, people living in temporary and non-traditional housing conditions prior to the fire really struggled to access assistance. Okay, hopefully my internet stays stable. I just got a note there. And then really which gets to the heart of that, resilient recovery necessarily everything being the way it was before. These groups had a lot of conversations about really wanting to be a restored community rather than a recovered community, and particularly in terms of housing, conversations centered on how to do better than returning people to their pre-fire status, which was precarious in many situations. And then here are some emerging priorities and opportunities that came out of these conversations, and that is really, they're from the kind of logistical and practical to more visionary and long-term opportunities. The first being that really in advance of the next disaster, having a central portal was also, I think, on a state level, which has been through Oregon Emergency Management. There is now one portal for wildfire, but really at the local level, and identifying like who's responsible for that, and really making sure that not only government but nonprofit able to have information in one place for people to access and could promote that. Also, there was some lessons around reviewing and documenting the lessons learned and developing guides and updating existing plans and providing training to prepare for future disasters. For example, the county planning department was overwhelmed with requests for septic confirmation, zoning, and other information required for insurance claims, as well as building permit applications. And many of the staff, day in and day out, were hearing traumatic stories of survivors, and many of them were also survivors themselves. So I think an interest on the county's part, as well as all the partners in the long-term recovery group, was to think more about trauma-informed planning and types of training that might help folks be more prepared for next time. There was also an interest in any of you who work in government or business, for that matter. You may be familiar with a continuity of operations plan, which implies that the planning department, for permitting and planning support, that wasn't something they necessarily defined in detail. And as I mentioned, they're interested in, at the time, more opportunities and support for trauma-informed service and planning. And as a natural hazards mitigation planner, this topic came up, and I will definitely plug, is really the importance of engaging in long-range natural hazards mitigation planning, whether that's through regular updates of a natural hazards mitigation plan, which really can, while it's focused on mitigation, can include projects and over with mitigation. The county has gone on to develop a community wildfire protection plan, which is another tool that can identify projects to reduce risk in the future, as well as related to evacuation and public information campaigns. The county also noted that they really need to complete their multi-county mass care and sheltering plan. And it was noted too that while there were some existing local groups already active, for example, there's community organizations, active organizations that exist around the country, but it was observed that in Oregon, the way that the COADs form and operate, there's a lack of local consistency. So that's something that folks felt would be helpful to have discussed kind of at a higher level and try and bring some consistency. And then lastly, coming back to the issue of housing, which is certainly a theme, there was a desire and an opportunity seen to really further continue to prioritize long-term coordination and support for housing development, particularly workforce housing, which is so important out at the coast. And then lastly, just bigger picture, overall the need for system-wide solutions, such as road network repair and maintenance out in the more rural areas of the county, and funding for local water systems and public safety services in fire impacted areas, which really were rural and had, harder for those services to reach. And then, coming from the planning side, there was also just a interest to consider that really other community needs and services really should be accommodated within cities, and incorporated areas that have resources and expertise. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Deb.
Great. Thanks, Susan. We're really hoping your internet holds out to get us through this presentation. Really appreciate it, y'all. I will move through this final case study quickly so we can have plenty of time for discussion. There's some great questions out there. So I'm going to just touch on some work we did along with talent. This is one of the first CAP projects we did, wildfire recovery. We entered conversations probably within, I think it was 4 or 5 months after the fires, we started talking to folks in the Santiam Canyon area. So just a reminder, this is two really enormous fires came together just east of the city of Salem, which is our capital. Salem is about 45 minutes to an hour south of Portland, and you can get into Santiam Canyon within, hour 15 or something, depending on where you are in the Portland metro region, just to give you some context. So 400,000 acres burned. That's a lot of land. It was a significant amount of sort of forest and timberland. Really importantly, the fire, like the McKenzie River fire, traveled up the river corridor or down the river corridor, depending on which way the fire was burning. But that Santiam River provides drinking water for 177,000 people in the Salem area, not just the people in Santiam River Canyon. So very sensitive area. It also has one of the most beautiful wilderness areas. The Opal Creek Wilderness has an ancient forest, old growth trees, definitely impacted by the wildfires, has lots of recreational opportunities, reservoir, the river itself, et cetera. It also has a sort of string of really small cities that are spaced pretty far apart as you get into the canyon. Quite a bit of rural residential, some workforce housing for people finding affordability out there and working in Salem, some second homes, so sort of a mix of folks that are impacted. And then there's a very complex web of property ownership, even on the forest lands. There's BLM, there's Forest Service, county, state, Detroit Reservoir, et cetera. So that sort of lots of different entities were impacted by this, private timber companies as well. So 5 incorporated cities, most of them very small, over 2 counties, primarily in the one county, Marion County. Folks impacted 2,700 residents, 400 homes. Really important. The people impacted sort of skewed a little bit older than is typical in Oregon, and a third of the households had people with disabilities in them. Next slide, Susan. So because we were really early in the conversation, and you all have heard a lot about sort of trauma and engagement fatigue, people are trying to sort of find their way through the many webs of getting service and rebuilding. we came to agreement with the county, and then we have a organization here that's a Council of Governments, Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. We worked for sort of a collection of governments, but it's anyway, they contract out with some of the cities and do some of the planning work in the canyon. So we agreed to sort of tread lightly and not get into engaging community members one-on-one as they were sort of scattered and trying to figure out their immediate needs. But we did offer to do some early background research and sort of a scan of planning documents and policies and sort of compile all that in one place. So when communities, the cities, the county were ready to move forward with sort of real rebuilding, sort of envisioning a future of what recovery looks like in the canyon, there'd be this foundational pieces that they could sort of pull off the shelf. We also sort of did this to try to help them have a resource they could sort of plug and play, if you will, into grant applications and other resources they were seeking. So if you could go to the next slide, Susan, I'll just shortcut us here. We ended up producing what we called a living document, and it's sort of a series of research topics, kind of cut sheets, mini reports, if you will. There were 11 topics. They're there on the right-hand side. These were sort of structured. For each one, we structured them to sort of get into, key findings, existing plans, policies, projects, things that were happening before the fire, and what are the implications post-fire. So projects that were midway, do they still make sense? Or yes, they absolutely need to be accelerated, et cetera. And then we also did some analysis, just looking for opportunities to make things a little bit better in recovery, and some recommendations for short and long term. And all of these, we'll make sure when I stop talking here that we get Christine a link for you in the chat where you can access all the products and information our CAP program is produced for all of these folks. One of the products we did produce in the Santiam project, but it was used by everyone and we continue to use it, and it continues to be accessed, is a overall sort of planning best practices for wildfire recovery and rebuilding. Some of the information in here isn't specific to wildfire, but we did try to focus it on that. Most importantly, it was collecting and compiling sort of planning related information. As anyone who's been through any of this, you know, there's tons of information out there. It's all over the place. But it's not always in one place, first of all, and it's not all relevant to planning. So we really tried to think through how to sort of categorize this specifically, or sort of compile this specifically for planners' use. And then with the help of the Council of Government staff, we kind of structured it to provide some resources that are relevant to government agencies, resources that are relevant to other community-based partners who are working or trying to help with this recovery, and then also sort of what individuals and property owners can do and think about. Again, they wouldn't necessarily come to our website to find this, but local agencies and partners could use this guide to help local households and property owners. Next slide, Susan. So a few lessons. I mean, we, as I mentioned, primarily this was a research project. We were sort of simmering in the background, providing resources to the folks who were doing the sort of one-on-one consultation with people impacted and sort of thinking about plans for the future. As I just mentioned, there's many best practice resources available, but they're rarely packaged for planners into a single accessible location. We hope we've at least started that path. I'm sure it could be improved. Our assessment was, we feel solid about the assessments we made, but of course it was lacking community engagement for lots of reasons, but it suffers because of that, because we weren't able to sort of embed sort of directly community conversations into our work, but that's okay. We were really focused on sort of getting organized. There have, no surprise, been a lot of changes just because of the sort of the great reshuffling that we've all been through with workforce, but also just what happens in these recovery processes is people dip in and dip out based on sort of where we are in the recovery process. FEMA has different resources available at different times. Local recovery managers come on later in the process. In the case of the Canyon, most of the cities don't have planners. They have city recorders who kind of run. Most of them didn't even have city managers, if I recall. But they were also folks that were impacted by the fires. So just sort of trying to figure out how to keep the information and knowledge pulled together is not simple. And then also, I think many of our communities haven't been fully digitized or haven't fully digitized some of these foundational documents and policies that are really important for recovery planning. So just sort of needing to know, we had a great partner in the Council of Governments, but really needing to know where your documents are located, how to find them, and then sort of move forward, how to share those with people that are trying to help you move forward. And before I hand it off for some big picture ideas, and honestly, we will get to questions, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of things. One is FEMA was a really important partner in all of this work for CAP. We were sort of joined at the hip. We had the great fortune of having FEMA planners who are from Oregon. And so they had a really strong familiarity and great networks, and really helped connect communities to our pro bono services at a time where they didn't have the funding available yet. There's money coming in, but it's not always available up front. So we tried to fill those gaps. And to that point, I think the case studies show how we have very different projects with sort of very different products. That's because we followed the lead of the communities we were working in and asked them what they needed at that time. And we were sort of thought partners. They gave us an idea, we'd run with it. We developed the scopes of work. We sort of negotiated through that. But want to acknowledge all the work of all of our CAP members, as well as our FEMA partners, really important. So I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Mary and Susan to wrap us up quickly, hopefully, please.
Yeah, we actually have a number of additional slides going through some of the lessons learned and cataloging some of the resources, but given where we are on time, I'm wondering if we should actually hold on that. And
if you wouldn't mind, I'm just looking through the questions. I think the lessons learned, if you want to give us the bird's eye view of that, I think that would actually be really helpful, just based on the questions that I'm seeing come through.
All right, I'll try to crank through this really, really quickly. So basically, equity is a key factor in the recovery process. I think you've heard this from us repeatedly at this point. We also feel like this should be a driving factor in preparation for a disaster as well, for a few different reasons. Namely, once people relocate, it's really difficult to get them to return. Also, many of the communities we worked with were already experiencing a shortage of affordable and workforce housing before the fire. This became even more of a problem after the fires. And fundamentally, the most socially vulnerable members of the community are going to be the most difficult to assist following a disaster. So we saw this play out with folks living off the grid in Lane County, also with non-citizen residents in Talent and Phoenix. They're very unlikely to apply for any type of government assistance, and they're also very unlikely to have insurance or other forms of support. We've mentioned this repeatedly too. Equity consideration should also apply to the emergency responders, the planning staff, the case managers, the people providing community assistance. Some of them have lost homes through this process as well. And regardless, it takes a lot of emotional space to be able to support people going through a trauma this significant. And those staff likely need their own support networks as well. And then finally, during the course of our conversations with various communities, we heard this distinction and it really stood out to us. There's a big difference between a recovered community and a restored community. And some, not all, of the communities who suffered through the 2020 fires might be considered on their way to recovery at this point, in the sense that infrastructure may be back up and running, basic needs are being met, people have shelter, those types of things. But it's a really long journey to restoration, and a place where a community is thriving again. And next, we wanted to also talk a little bit about resilience. So resilience has become quite the buzz these days. We hear it all over the place. In many cases, it's talking about the physical systems or the infrastructure that can weather extreme events or circumstances. What really stood out to us through this process is the importance of social resilience. If a community is not well connected prior to a disaster, it's very, very difficult to make those connections post-disaster. So just the importance of building those networks, including relationships with community-based organizations, those groups who already have networks and trust within the community is really, really important. It's critical to identify those groups who are most at risk as well, and they're the most likely to be heavily impacted. So know how to reach them and know how to help. Building relationships with local partners should also be a key part of the work. So getting to know people in the school district, public health agencies, caseworkers, because those are going to be your partners when you're going through a relief and recovery process. And next. A lot of this may feel like it's outside of the realm of planning. So what specifically should planners be thinking about in your own communities? Number one, keep your plans up to date. It will make the recovery process much, much smoother if you have a recent plan to work from. Two, tap into federal and state grants that are available for resilience planning. And there are a lot of them out there, increasingly more all the time. And make sure that when you do that work, it has a really strong community engagement component to it, because that process itself can be community network building that can help once if you happen to find yourself in need of a recovery process in the future. And if you don't have either the budget or the bandwidth to take on new planning efforts, look for opportunities to fold resilience planning into the planning work that you're already doing or that you have coming up. So whether that's a comp plan, whether that's a downtown visioning plan, whether that's a neighborhood plan, there's likely an opportunity to assess some of the physical risks, identify opportunities to mitigate them, and most importantly, to build awareness and networks across your community. And then one other very specific but very important detail to mention, we heard this across the board, was the need for a single place for centralized permitting as well as emergency services. That came into play repeatedly across each of the different project efforts that we worked on, just knowing where that one-stop shop should go to keep community members and help planners deal with this sudden influx of building permits that they're likely to encounter in the event of a disaster. So I think that is it on our lessons learned.
Yeah, and just a reminder that Christine has put a number of resources in the chat about some new legislation, how to get to our website and dig in a little bit more to the work we did.
So you have links to all of these great resources in the chat. And then I'm gonna stop sharing.
Okay, so let's get into a couple questions here. The first one is really kind of overarching here. What have you all learned from other natural disasters? The example is Katrina, of course. But have you looked at other natural disasters for guidance, either before, during, after?
I'll start, and maybe Erin, you can add in. Absolutely, that was one of the first things we did when we had a bit of an ad hoc group that came together from our chapter late September, immediately after these wildfires happened, or at least started. And we called our planning networks. We called planners in California that had been through it. We called planners in Colorado, Texas, maybe Idaho. I don't quite remember that. I reached out to folks in Louisiana. It's, flooding is different than hurricanes, are very different than the wildfire impacts. And then also just the context of most of this happening in sort of forested rural areas was also quite different. But the saying that, however, some of the great lessons we learned, we talked to a former city manager in Northern California who was in the midst of it, and also a planning commissioner in Colorado who went through a major flood, and she had some really good advice as well. My two bits I recall very clearly, how lucky we were to have FEMA planners who were local, knew the political context, knew our land use system, knew people. That was like I mean, we were just really lucky about that. And then I can't remember the second one, so I'll let Erin let me know.
I think one of the other things that we learned from talking to folks who had gone through other disasters, Katrina among them, was just a better understanding of what to expect in terms of timeline, how long the immediate remediation efforts take, and that's really the first 6 to 12 months is just getting things back up and running and some of the basics. And then at about the time that that work is wrapping up, local volunteers on the ground are very likely to be fully maxed out, just completely burnt out, no more energy, no more oomph left to go. And that is really the time when they need assistance, is at about a year out. And that was really helpful, I think, as we were charting out how best to help these various communities, is when to step in and also when to step back.
Thank you. In terms of wildfires, in your experience, are they primarily naturally occurring? Is there arson involved, or how do they, at least in Oregon, how do they come about? Is it a lack of controlled burning? Like, is it just that there's not enough resources to go around? Tell us.
That could be a whole webinar in and of itself. I mean, I think there's a variety of different causes, right? We see that across the board, from power lines sparking, which was the case for a number of the fires in Oregon. Occasionally, yes, it is arson. To,
Or fireworks.
Fireworks, yeah, lightning. I mean, there's a whole variety of causes. I think ubiquitously, our forest management practices have put us in a position where things are readily ignitable, regardless of the initial cause. And that's a big problem.
I'll just add this, the wildfires in 2020 were exceptional because they happened in the really wet parts. The fire on the coast that we talked about in Lincoln County, that's the wettest part of Oregon. They get something like 20 feet of rain a year. It might be 18 feet. It's a lot. So they happen in places that everyone always thought was like, oh, it's the coast. It's always wet there. It's never going to catch fire. I mean, obviously people who know better know our susceptibility, but this was a pretty unusual circumstance that most of these fires happen on what we call the west side of the Cascades, the wetter side. Though our forests, we often have fires every summer.
This is an interesting question. And, we've done a lot of this work. I know APA National has, many chapters have, where they're starting to look at the connections across the aisle in terms of public health. So we're starting to coordinate with our friends in the department over and for a variety of reasons that make a lot of sense. But, the conversation really did allude to, like, this is heavy stuff. And is there a piece within, mitigation and recovery where we should be reaching out to our public health community or our medical community and saying, hey, like, let's coordinate?
Lots of head nodding, yes, from our panel. And I think, from our experience, we would recommend don't wait until you're in the recovery process to do that. Actually do that beforehand. Anytime you're putting together any sort of preparatory plan, engage your public health staff and start to make those connections again, so that relationship is already forged before you get into the chaos of a disaster.
Just one little anecdote on that too. We had a great, I think partly because we're pro bono volunteers, the state was willing to kind of take a risk and letting us see if we could use the Department of Human Services data that they collect on, I mean, it was aggregated data. We don't have individual data, but data they collect from survivors of the wildfire in Lane County, and see what we can make of that for planning purposes. They weren't collecting that information for planning purposes. So a lot of it, there was sort of what I would call dirty data, lots of missing fields, very inconsistent tracking. I think if you made those connections, our hope is that if we're making these connections now, we can start talking to our health departments and our human services departments about, when you're collecting this, it needs to be for more than just your case management, social outreach in the next 6 months. Can you also make sure you are documenting whether they're veterans, documenting whether they have a disability, documenting where they end up, like whatever the case may be. So I think there are some real opportunities there because they are the folks working with community members all the time. Not just in disaster planning, there's tons of opportunities to connect with those health departments and social workers for all sorts of planning reasons.
We also learned that a lot of the people who need those services post-disaster have never had to navigate systems of dealing with public health departments or dealing with health and human services, you know, any other sort of public benefits. So having good connections and kind of clear-cut processes for how to help new users of those systems navigate them set up is really important too.
I have one last question, but you're not going to be able to answer it because it would take literally a whole other webinar. So my point is, I'm going to need you all to come back so that we can do a whole other webinar and talk about vulnerable locations and whether or not people should move back to those locations. What are homeowners insurance implications? What are the community's implications? We've had webinars about this in the past, specifically focused on coastal communities, you know, where their homes are literally just falling off cliffs into the ocean, and you know, they come back, and do they move back? Do they not? And then overarching, what are the equity implications of this? How do we do it equitably? How do we assist these people, you know, in either coming back or moving elsewhere? And I don't have time to look it up, but we do have a couple webinars that talked about literally moving whole communities of people to a different location. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So we're going to need y'all to come back so that we can talk more about that and relocation and implications of all of that. Because, you know, it's going to be happening more and more. This is our climate, pun intended. And we're going to have to start dealing with these things. So we need to get in front of it, which is, you know, why we're here talking about this today. So it's 2:30 Eastern time over here. So it's time for us to wrap up. And I thank all of you for joining us today as panelists and the Oregon chapter for putting this session together. Thank you all. You're wonderful volunteers. Thank you for doing this. And everyone, don't forget to register for our upcoming sessions, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Log those CM credits. We're recording this. Head over to our YouTube channel to get this recording and all of our previous recordings. What am I forgetting? I don't know. I think that's about it. So everyone, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody.